Welcome everybody again. We had just waited for a couple more people to join, but I would like to start welcoming you to this webinar on MRV of measures in the transport sector, highlighting the new passenger and freight transport volume of the Compendium of Greenhouse Gas Baselines and Monitoring, which is our new publication that has just been launched yesterday here in Bonn at a technical expert meeting on support for accelerated actions as part of the UNFCCC Climate Change Conference. My name is Urda Eichhorst. I work as a Transport and Climate Change Advisor for GIZ in the project called Advancing Transport Climate Strategies, which is financed through the International Climate Initiative of the German Environment Ministry. I will give you a little bit of background on the Compendium of Greenhouse Gas Baseline and Monitoring, and a short introduction to the work that we have done at GIZ on MRV in the transport sector. Then Charles Kooshian from the Center of Clean Air Policy will present the passenger and freight transport volume before Marion Vieweg will give us more detail on MRV of transport measures and how they link to national level bottom-up greenhouse gas inventories of transport emissions. And then we'll have our Q&A session in the end. The Compendium is an effort coordinated by the UNFCCC Secretariat, and in person, Victoria Novikova, who unfortunately cannot join us here today because of her obligations with the climate change conference. And it's a multi-stakeholder effort of a couple of partners that you can see here: the World Bank, WRI, FAO, UNDP, IRENA, and others, including GIZ, in order to provide a resource map on methodologies and tools that are already existing to how to calculate greenhouse gas emission baselines and how to also calculate emission reductions in different sectors. So the volume is meant to cover all IPCC sectors in the end, and the current volumes of the Compendium include one on national level mitigation actions that has already been published earlier, and now the second one on passenger and freight transport, which was just published yesterday. There's one coming up on agriculture, forestry and other land use, as well as one on manufacturing industry and construction, and one on buildings, which is coordinated by the Secretariat themselves. The agriculture one is coordinated through the FAO, and the industry one through the World Bank. And as you can tell, the Compendium will, in the end, cover a wide range of mitigation actions at different levels. And it was developed with the thinking to provide countries and institutions with guidance and support on how to develop MRV concepts and how to calculate emissions. And the idea of the Compendium pretty much stems from the discussion about NAMAs, nationally appropriate mitigation actions, which are voluntary mitigation actions that countries can decide to undertake in order to increase their level of ambition on mitigation. And when this whole concept of NAMAs came up, and also NAMA starting to be developed, it is part of the NAMA concept that mitigation effects have to be quantified. And for many stakeholders, this was a difficult issue, not knowing how exactly to go about quantifying the emissions of different mitigation actions. So the idea was that the UNFCCC Secretariat could support a process that helps provide that information for different sectors, for participants in this area to make it easier to get access to all the knowledge and methodologies that already exist. And how did we, as GIZ, end up coordinating the work on the transport volume? Well, we have been working on mitigation in the transport sector for a long time. And what we try to do is now to really systematically support climate change policy and actions in transport in our partner countries. We are a development organization, And we work with partner countries around the world. We have offices in most of our partner countries, and we have different kinds of projects through which we support our partners. And one sort of these projects are what we call global projects, including what you can see here on the left in red, advancing transport climate strategies, as well as the project transfer that works on the development of NAMAs in the transport sector. And how do we work is that with the Advancing Transport Climate Strategies project, we really work at the national level with transport ministries on implementing their nationally determined contributions, so their mitigation activities, and to look into scenarios for mitigation potentials, and also increasingly support countries in developing greenhouse gas inventories for the transport sector specifically. And then on the other hand, the transfer project looks at the mitigation action level, so not the strategic level, but as the first project does, but more at the mitigation action level, and actually developing NAMAs that are then ready to seek international climate finance. And this is the third column that you can see here in the gray, is the implementation of these mitigation actions, then some of which have already received funding through the NAMA facility, as is the case in Indonesia or in Peru. And as you can see in the middle, all these different steps of engagement also always include some form of quantification of emissions, being ex ante estimations or ex post quantification and reporting. So we've been working in this area for a long time, and under the transfer project, we also set up a so-called MRV expert group for MRV in the transport sector. And this was about 6 years ago that the group was set up, and both Chuck and Marion have been part of this expert group as well, and have been supporting the work that we've done on documenting and developing guidance for MRV in transport for also a couple of years now. So this is just to give you a quick overview of the work that we have done. It's all available for download, and I just wanted to point out again that there's like these two different levels. There's the mitigation action level that also the transport volume focuses on, and then there's the national level that is becoming increasingly important now that we have the Paris Agreement, the Paris Climate Agreement, and countries have all submitted their NDCs, nationally determined contributions, so their own mitigation plans, which from which stems a new dynamic in the countries also to report their emissions more rigorously, and not only to report their emissions at the national level, but also to report on mitigation actions. And so in this discourse, we see that in our work in the countries that one question is popping up more and more often, and this is the question of how the two can come together, the reporting on measures as well as the reporting on emissions at the national level. And this is also why we would like to include today the second presentation by Marion on exactly that questions: to what extent can we actually use sectoral, in this case transport, greenhouse gas emission inventories to also get information on the MRV of measures. So this is why we group these two presentations together, and I hope that you will enjoy them. We will also provide you with all these slides after the presentation, and just to mention it already now, it's also in the handout. You should have received it, that in addition to the transport volume, we've also just published this background paper on synergies and limitations of using bottom-up greenhouse gas inventories in the transport sector for the MRV of measures. So it should be available to you already. And now I would like to hand over to our first speaker, Charles Kooshian, who works for the Center for Clean Air Policy and has been working as a transport planner and analyst for a long time with a focus on urban transport, and has recently been also deeply involved in the development of transit-oriented development, NAMA, in Colombia. And he is the lead author of the transport volume of the compendium. So I'm very glad to have him here with me today, and would like to give the word to you.
Thank you, Urda. And we're all excited that this passenger and freight volume has come out now and is offering a practical guide for people to start to figure out how to do the MRV on the different projects and mitigation actions that they may be proposing. So I'd like to just spend a few minutes showing you what is in this guide and how it can help you if you have a mitigation action and you're trying to figure out how to propose MRV for it, how to do MRV for this action. So the way we organize the guide is based on the concept of a bottom-up model of transport emissions. And Marion's going to talk a little bit later about the top-down model and how the two models have synergies and can work together. But this guide is made for local, usually city level, but also some regional and national level projects and programs. And it's organized around this bottom-up model, which you may have heard of already, the as-if model, which stands for activity, share, intensity, and fuel. Because as you probably know, every time there's a trip, right, a person or a piece of freight needs to go somewhere, and that trip will make a certain length, and it will take a certain mode, and this will generate person or passenger kilometers or freight tons, ton kilometers. Then that mode is affected by the occupancy of the mode or the load factor, and then that will convert into vehicle kilometers, and then the vehicle kilometers, each type of vehicle will use a certain amount of fuel, which is the intensity, and that translates into the fuel use. And then depending on the type of fuel, it will emit a certain amount of greenhouse gases. So this model looks, well, it doesn't look simple, it looks a little bit complicated, and of course it gets much more complicated as you disaggregate it by the different modes and the different types of fuel. So when you're faced with MRV design for a mitigation action, it can become very complicated, and there are lots of different methodologies out there, and it gets confusing. What we try to do in this volume is to use this type of a graphic to help you to understand how your mitigation action should be affecting certain variables in these equations, so you'll know where to look, what variables you need to collect data on, and then we'll talk about where to go to get that data and how to use that data. So we've grouped the mitigation actions. I'll show later that we've made 8 groupings at this point, but there could be more. And they're grouped by their main effect. For example, one of the names of the groups is intra-urban mass rapid transit investments. So these are BRT projects, metro projects. It could be cable, car, gondola projects, other types of tram, but they all have the intention to shift the mode, to shift trips from private vehicle mode to mass transit mode. For as an alternative, there could be another type of mitigation action promoting biofuels, and so for that, the intention is to change the fuel. And so you would look at the emission factor portion of the graphic. There's also another aspect to MRV, and this is the purpose of the MRV. You know that you can, of course, do the MRV before the intervention, before the action, which is the ex ante, or you can do MRV after the action, which is ex post. And you have different reasons for doing this. Before you perform an action, you want to predict how effective it is so that you can prioritize the policies. You might want to prepare a plan with several different actions and know what you can expect. And of course, you may be asking for funding, and the funder will say, how much reduction are you going to get for this action? And the point is that for ex-ante analysis, you have to project into the future two different things. You project a baseline, and you also have to project the with mitigation scenario, the mitigation scenario. So ex-ante analysis requires the ability to project two different types of baseline. Ex-post analysis is a little bit different. Ex-post analysis, you can go and measure the results of your intervention, which is a problem of a different sort, gathering that data and measuring. And then you need to compare that with the baseline, which may have been done ex ante, but you may be doing it now based on different things. So there's different types of tools available, and some methodologies have been developed specifically for ex post. A lot of CDM methodologies, for example, have a very strong ex post focus. Other methodologies have a more of an ex ante focus and could be used as sketch tools or more rapid assessment tools to see what might be your best option. And so we keep this framework in mind, that where does the intervention have its effect, and what is the purpose of this intervention, or I mean this MRV methodology. Oops, now I've lost the...
Why?
Oops. So that what we've done, if you can see that when the next slide comes, is we take all of the available, or many of the available methodologies. There we go, thank you. And we organize this map. We call it our navigation map. And it helps you to choose the right methodology based on what you see on the left, the objective. Is it ex ante? Is it ex post? Are you trying to prioritize your policies, or are you doing more formal mitigation planning? Are you asking for funding support? And are you reporting, or are you doing emissions trading? So we have a map, and this graphic here is showing there are different types of methodologies, and they tend to have different levels of accuracy and be effective for different objectives and different purposes. So using this map across these three dimensions, the purpose, the level of accuracy, and the type of tool, we show you the different methodologies for the different types of mitigation action groups. And then it's not only a map, we also have tables, and I'll show you some of those in a little while, that tell you the specific methodologies. We'll have links to how to obtain them, and a little bit of quick guidance about how their applicability and scope is. Do you get a computer, a piece of software, a spreadsheet or something with this methodology? How good do we think is the documentation? Are there a lot of default values? So we've done a bit of analysis on these to help you to choose the best methodology for your particular action. Each methodology starts with this cause-impact chain, which takes the model, which I showed you earlier, and specifically puts these orange boxes showing where this type of mitigation action has the effect. So in this case, for an alternative fuels incentive action, you can increase the number of vehicles that are using alt fuels. You can increase the quantity of alternative fuel that is used and decrease, of course, the quantity of fossil fuels that are used. You're trying to change the carbon intensity. You need to check that variable because natural gas, for example, has a different intensity than biodiesel. And then we also, in many of these, show some of the unintended effects or the life cycle effects that you also will need to consider. So this graphic looks complicated at first, but as you go down it, it will help to guide you to the types of data that you're going to need and why you need that data. Here's another example of the cause-impact chain for a different type of mitigation action. This is a mass transit investment. So if you have, and on the left you see the types of actions, and here there are two kinds of possible actions. First, building new infrastructure, a new bus lane, dedicated bus lane, a new system. Also, you can include new transit vehicles so that the vehicles will have improved fuel efficiency. So some of these may apply and some of these may not to your specific action, but you need to use this graphic to guide yourself to choose the data that you're going to need. And also you see for this that there's possible induced trips, right? If there's more capacity for travel, people may choose to travel more. You need to take that into account. You can have effects on the occupancy of other types of modes, which would cause their load factor to go down. It becomes complicated, but using this graphic helps you to understand when you choose your methodology what you're going to need to collect for the data and how you're going to use it. And here's an example of the navigation map applied to the comprehensive urban transport program type of mitigation action. This is having that urban transport program, of course, is a coordinated mitigation action that may include a lot of other sub-actions, and it will have a complicated type of causal chain, and there are different methodologies for different purposes. And we have the names of a lot of travel demand models, which is actually a very difficult but the best way to estimate future effects of a plan like this. But there are other less accurate but easier to use models, such as the TEAM models. CCAP has done an emissions guidebook, for example. And then as you go to the other ex post objectives, there are several different methodologies that have been developed by GIZ, by the, I don't even know who did this one, anyway, by other groups that look at more accurate ways to do an ex post analysis. So for each type of mitigation action, we will have a map like this that shows you a number of different options that you have and how those options are best used. But that's not all. We include the tables, as you can see, with the name of each action and some of these qualitative and quantitative judgments about them. We talk about the potential for double counting and what types of things you need to look out for. And we talk about the different types of data and the disaggregation of data that would fit into the different levels of accuracy. These are similar to the tiers. They don't correspond exactly. We have the three tiers, or the three levels of accuracy here, and they basically correspond to the three tiers, but not exactly, because these are all bottom-up models. So for each of these 8 different types of mitigation action, we'll show you these things. And the 8 types of actions that we have at this point, you can see here, range from intra-urban mass transit, comprehensive programs, vehicle efficiency improvement, alt fuels, urban, intra-urban rail. We have freight transport mode shift. We do a chapter on national fuel economies, and we're still working on a chapter on pricing policies. Now, this covers a broad range of different types of actions, and there are lots of different methodologies within each category. And it pretty much covers a lot. But if you can think of some more, feel free to contact Urda or myself, and we'll try to analyze these, at least until the next round of revisions in this document, because this is going to be a living document that keeps tabs on all the methodologies, at least for a while. So if there's a new methodology for transporting camels, for example, will be interested in looking at that. And as Urda said, you can look at, you can access this right now, the draft version, or the first version, at the NAMA News website. And SLOCAT, the Partnership for Sustainable Low Carbon Transport, has also done an even more wider ranging database of different methodologies, which we pulled from in order to analyze these. They have to like 140 now methodologies in a spreadsheet with information about each one that helps you. If you don't like any of the ones that we have in the guidebook, perhaps you can find another one in the SLOCAT database. So I hope that this gets you interested in using this tool, and I thank you for listening to my part, and we'll pass it on to Marion to explain how these mitigation action at the project level or the program level can also be informed by inventory work that you'll be doing.
Thank you, Chuck, very much for this presentation. Before we move on, I would also like to say again that if you have questions now, please just type them up in the questions pane, and we are already collecting the first questions. And once we are ready with the Q&A session, then we will get back to them and answer them afterwards. Thank you. So Marion Vieweg is our next speaker. She is an independent consultant who has specialized in transparency-related work and policy analysis, especially with a look on mitigation in the energy and transport sector. And she has a lot of experiences with the UNFCCC negotiations, including its transparency provisions. And as I said before, she has for a long time supported our work on MRV in the transport sector, and also the work in that area of other organizations, including the ICAT initiative. ICAT stands for Initiative for Climate Action Transparency, and it is another multi-donor project, also co-financed through the German Environment Ministry. And it's actually in that initiative that a new methodology for pricing policies is currently under development and will be included as the last chapter that is currently not in the first version that is available online, but will be later this year. So I would like to hand over to Marion to give us her presentation.
Thanks, Urda, and welcome also to everybody from my side. And as Urda already mentioned in her introduction, we had a look at how does this MRV of transport measures fit into this larger context of activities that are now happening around NDC implementation, enhanced reporting under the UNFCCC, and more regular reporting, and also the drive of many countries to improve their inventories and to move towards more bottom-up inventories from previous or currently more top-down inventory approaches. And so we wanted to look at how far we can link these two initiatives and see what added value do bottom-up inventories have for the MRV of transport measures. Urda, can you either? Yeah, thank you. So what I quickly want to do today is have a very, very brief introduction into the inventories in the transport sector for those of you that are not so familiar, including a few clarifications on different use of terminology between the inventory world and the MRV of measures world, and then discuss a few challenges that are that we have in boundary setting between inventories and MRV. The calculation approaches, I don't think I'll go into any detail, as Chuck has just very nicely already gone through that. And then I will just briefly present one example how we can use inventory data for the MRV of a measure. And there is more examples in the paper that you also see under handouts that you can actually download right now, and that will also be included in the materials sent. And then quickly discuss synergies and limitations. So on terminology, we've seen the basic approach to calculating the emissions, and in principle it's all about activity multiplied by an emission factor. And when we see this equation, it is very important to note that there is differences in what people mean by activity when they use the term. Particularly when you use inventory guidelines, the IPCC has this equation as the very basic equation, and they use activity in two different ways, either as the fuel used, which is the Tier 1 methodology, or the distance traveled, which is Tier 3 methodology, and that is very important to clarify. In the MRV of transport sector, activity normally refers to either the vehicle kilometers traveled or passenger kilometers traveled or ton kilometers transported. So at the very beginning of this bottom-up methodology that Chuck showed, and while fuel used would actually be very much lower in this calculation schematic that we've seen. So it is very important to specify and to be aware of what kind of activity data is actually meant. Next. The other important differentiation is how to use top-down versus bottom-up. You already heard Chuck mention that inventories were talking more about top-down, which from an inventory perspective is not totally correct, because also inventories can be bottom-up. So we're looking at definitely a national approach, but in the inventory setting, top-down is has a slightly different meaning than in the MRV sector. In the MRV sector, we talk about top-down if it's energy-based, so it's either directly on fuel consumption or directly on emission factors, whereas in the bottom-up approach, we talk about activity data in the sense of distance traveled. So the IPCC guidelines determine top-down and bottom-up based on the level of detail, and that can be with activity data either on the energy base or the mileage base. So that is very important to recognize, because particularly for the 1996 IPCC guidelines, the Tier 2 is considered a bottom-up methodology, but it is based on energy as activity data. So that gets confusing very quickly, so we always need to be very clear what we're talking about. Next. So this looks very complicated, but it tries to help understand what the differences in the different tiers are in the inventories, because that it basically influences what kind of data you will need to collect to prepare your inventory, and that in turn will determine how useful your inventory exercise is for your MRV of measures. So the Tier 1 actually uses, as we already said, uses fuel sold. The Tier 2 then is still using the fuel sold, but is adding additional detail, and it's also increasing the level of disaggregation. The Tier 3 is actually adding further disaggregation with vehicle types and emission control technology. But the most important difference here is that it is changing the activity data from fuel sold to distance. So it's actually moving from a top-down approach, as we define it in the MRV of measures, to a bottom-up approach. Next. A lot of countries are already moving towards using the 2006 IPCC guidelines. They are slightly different in two ways. One of the most important ones is there is a change in method for the determination of CO2. They do not include a Tier 3 method for CO2. They're basically sticking with a CO2 determined by country-specific emission factors. So using fuel used with country-specific emission factors. Only the other gases are then determined using a Tier 3 approach with a truly bottom-up methodology based on the distance. They're also introducing new types of emissions, which is the warm-up phase. They're also actually including urea-based catalysts as a new category, and they're introducing operating conditions as a factor. So they're becoming more and more accurate. But the principle of top-down, bottom-up, and the types of data are very similar between the two methodologies. So having said that, this is the basis for what your data collection will look like for your inventory. So how can we make this, make use of this for the MRV of measures? There we have a few challenges. One is that we have a different geographic scope. The inventory is national in scope. Obviously, your measures may be national in scope, but a lot of them will not be. They will be for a region, a specific city, or even individual corridors, traffic corridors. So here we have to see how far data that we have available at the national level is scalable to that particular geographic region that we're talking about. We also have to consider that measures may overlap with other measures, and we need to also have a look at where does the data for the national level inventory actually come from, because that usually also doesn't come from counting and measuring each and every single vehicle in the country. It may come from surveys that are conducted within the country. So we need to look at maybe these survey areas overlap with the areas that my measure is operating in, and see how useful that data can be. Next. The other issue that we have with the inventory logic is that it only covers a a small range of emissions that are potentially interesting for our transport measures. And Chuck already alluded to that earlier. You may have upstream or downstream emissions connected to your transport activities that may be interesting for the MRV of your measure, but that are not relevant for the inventory. So you will have to certainly make adjustments to or add information to what you can get out of your inventory, just because it will only cover a small share of what is actually interesting for you. Next. So we're looking at one example, and which is national vehicle-based efficiency standards, and they could be either on fuel or directly on emissions. And you see here the logic is what Chuck already presented from the bottom-up perspective. What kind of data is needed to calculate your emissions, and here we're trying to highlight for this particular measure for efficiency standard, what are the key elements that are interesting for your MRV. And normally it depends obviously on the exact way your measure is designed, but normally it is obviously the fuel efficiency, but it could also be your fleet composition in the way that how it's distributed between different vehicle types, because that could be influenced by the way your standard is designed. If it allows, for example, for compensation of higher less efficient vehicles by introducing more very efficient vehicles or alternative propulsion systems. So depending on how that's structured, those two are the real interesting indicators in this calculation. Next. So we have looked at what kind of information can you actually get out of your inventory to answer the questions in your for your MRV. Also, again, depending on the objective of your analysis, ex ante or ex post. And here, for this particular example, we see that if we have an inventory that is at least tier 2, so with a more disaggregate information, then a lot of the information we need is actually already available in the inventory. We might have to downscale it to the regional level or to the geographic coverage, but the fleet composition should be available. Fuel efficiency by different vehicle types should be available, and for all other parameters we can pretty much use the average values or default values from the inventory. For ex post, that looks a little bit different, because here we would need to actually look at the fuel efficiency data from other sources, because we would want to verify that the vehicles that are actually coming onto the market fulfill that standard. So we would need to conduct some actual measurements at some point somewhere. So we certainly wouldn't want to use default values for that. Next. So that's already one of the limitations, where we will not be able to use all or find all of the information that we need depending on the purpose within the inventory. For subnational measures, city level measures, obviously we will need to downscale. We will need to see how far that inventory data is usable and applicable, and if we can downscale. Again, the coverage of the sector is limited in the inventory, so if we're having anything like electric transport, either public or private in electric cars, we will need to expand information using other sources to cover the electricity aspect. The same is actually true for anything that is biofuels, because also that is not covered in the transport part of the inventory. And particularly for ex-post evaluation, the inventory will, in most cases, not be sufficiently detailed. But on the other hand, we also have some synergy. So if we're looking at the data collection that we're doing for the MRV of measures, we can, in many cases, also use to actually feed into the transport inventory and to make that more accurate. So incentivize a move from top-down to more bottom-up inventories. Particularly if we manage to coordinate between different measures in different regions, that can then allow to offer a representative sample that can be used to estimate the national values. As we've already said, if we have at least tier 2 inventories, we can use a lot of this data to already estimate effects for ex-ante assessments, but to be able to fully use the synergies, particularly in of the first points that I mentioned, that we can use the data from MRV to actually generate or improve the inventory. What is absolutely essential is that we harmonize data definitions and collection methods, that we harmonize and align frequency and timing of the collection of data, as well as data formats and calculation methods. This is best achieved by a formalized institutional cooperation that then also coordinates all this and agrees on standardized formats and methods. So I think to sum it up, there is a lot of information that bottom-up inventories can provide to support the MRV of measures, but it's also the MRV of measures can provide a lot of input to improve the inventories at the national level. Thanks a lot, and as said, you can download the paper directly or later on from the GIZ website.
Thank you very much, Marion, for this presentation. And we have also collected quite a couple of questions already. We still have a good half hour for the questions, so we will move to the questions now. I'm just showing the slide of the compendium again. Here you can either scan the download link, or here you also have the link where it's provided in Clearview. And I would also already like to thank again the presenters, but also the audience. You have been very busy posing questions to us. So we will start with the first questions and see if we can get through all of them or only some of them. So one question is, for the ex-post calculation, can we use the same baseline as for ex-ante? This is a very good question, and one that usually comes up, so I would like to give it to Chuck first, and then I could also add to it.
Well, of course you could use the same baseline, but things will probably have changed by the time you get to the ex post analysis. And if you want the best accuracy, of course, you're going to want to look at your baseline again. But it really depends on the purpose of your MRV. If you're trying to, trade emissions, you may have some agreement that you make sure your baseline is up to date. If you're just trying to meet an emission commitment, maybe you don't need to, I don't know. But it's always better to change your baseline for the ex post analysis. But sometimes you don't have enough information about what might have happened in the absence of the intervention. So you just use the same ex ante baseline.
And maybe just adding to that, it's this question is actually what we referred to also, and which is also explained as a concept in the transport volume as dynamic baselines. So in order to have as good as possible a baseline, there are some parameters, at least that are usually for good quality are changed, and so that the baseline is recalculated for ex post as opposed to the one ex ante. And this can include very basic parameters such as GDP growth, economic growth, population growth, because these are often parameters that also affect the assumptions that you make, for instance, for the growth in the number of cars and things like that. So then you make an assumption in ex ante, but a couple of years later, then you can use the actual GDP growth that happened over the period, the time period, because then you already know the real GDP growth. So you would, if there's a difference, then you would probably want to change that parameter, for instance. And so in that sense, you can try to make the baseline as accurate as possible. But yes, it depends also on the methodologies and the type of commitment that is related to it. If you think about NDCs now, they have been submitted with a certain baseline, and so this is actually one discussion, I guess, that is coming up. To what extent is it worth maybe relooking at the baseline, recalculating it? But this changes international commitments then in a way. So this is an interesting discussion that will also come up in the NDC discussions. But I hope that we've answered your question on that one. If not, then please get back to us again. Another question is, does this tool, the transport volume, the tool include uncertainty or sensitivity analysis of emission reduction? So tool here I think refers to the transport volume, and whether uncertainty or sensitivity analysis is included.
Well, there's a brief discussion for each type of methodology on which variables have the most uncertainty, and a little bit about the sensitivity. But because it depends on each methodology, we can't be specific to each one, and you have to look at the methodologies one by one and try to determine that, which we don't have that answer for each particular methodology. Only is the general aspect of analyzing those type of actions.
Okay, thank you, Chuck. There's another question regarding will these materials be standardized by the UNFCCC? I will take that question. Of course, now it's I'm assuming the question is, will the methodologies be standardized by the UNFCCC? And the answer to that one is no. The purpose of the transport volume is to really give an overview and guide through existing methodologies as they are. It's not, it would be, of course, a much larger effort, and also not within the mandate of the UNFCCC Secretariat as at the moment to standardize methodologies for all sorts of mitigation actions. Of course, the CDM methodologies that are discussed and included, they have been standardized through the CDM Executive Board and the processes related to that. So, but there is no efforts currently ongoing to have the same level of standardization as was the case for the CDM for existing methodologies that have been used for NAMAs or other mitigation activities. And this is because that, yes, yeah, this was the idea with NAMAs, that they're voluntary, and so there is no such rigorous framework as with the emissions trading, and there's currently no mandate for that too. And actually, as the climate conference is ongoing, the discussions on exactly that issue also regarding the NDCs and how to report NDCs is ongoing. To what extent the reporting on NDCs should be standardized more or less, and there's very different views by different parties whether or not to standardize that further. Then we have a different, more technical question, which reads, fuel consumption depends upon occupancy of vehicles or freight load that the vehicles carry. So emissions calculations, should they also be based on the passenger kilometers or ton kilometers, not distance alone? Okay, I will copy this one to the chat so everyone can read it.
And in answer to that, that's a very interesting point, because certainly if a vehicle is heavily loaded, it's going to get poorer fuel economy than a vehicle that is lightly loaded within certain parameters. And for freight, it has more of an effect probably than for passengers. The emissions models that are used usually, I mean, there are some very sophisticated models out there that take into account other things that affect fuel economy, such as the speed or even the slope and the amount of stop and go and acceleration. And all of that stuff, it's fine to say you're improving your accuracy by, you know, including the speed profile or the slope profile and so forth, or the load, but you really don't have all of that information available. To base your analysis strictly on ton kilometers or passenger kilometers, you would end up using some sort of average anyway of those things. So in some cases, some freight analysis may be based on ton kilometers, but generally the highest level of accuracy is more disaggregated, and you would look at a lot of other things. And but I've never actually seen an emissions model that actually takes into account the load in the vehicle, because usually for freight the load is more or less the same. Anyway, it depends on the vehicle. So that's something that might, I don't know how we would end up modeling that in the future, but right now I don't know of anybody that does it that way.
Okay, thank you, Chuck. Let us know if there's another clarification question on that one, please, if there is. Let me just, I'm just going through the questions. Okay, there's one question that reads, how do we compare the baseline of ex ante and ex post with the inventory? Can we get a clarification on that question? Or Marion, I would hand this question to you, but the question again is, how can we compare ex ante and ex post baselines with the inventory?
Yeah, very good question, actually. Could do a whole webinar on that. Well, in terms of ex-ante assessment, it's a little bit more easy. when we're talking ex ante, we only have an inventory for the current moment, or most probably a few years back. So that usually presents us with the starting point for any ex ante analysis anyways. So that is also a question of consistency somehow between inventory data and MRV of measures. But in any case, that we don't have inventories for the future yet. So at this point in time, the inventory is the starting point for both the baseline, but also the policy scenario for ex ante assessments. As we go along in the future, the inventory actually becomes my policy scenario, because if I'm putting in place my measure, then anything I measure in the future obviously is taking into account the policy that's been implemented, or the activities that have been implemented. So then we're getting into the ex post assessment, where the inventory actually presents to a certain extent with the measure scenario, and the baseline needs to compare to that scenario and assess how much that was reduced compared to a world where the measures or activities would not have been carried out. All that needs to be taken with a grain of salt, because this is talking national measures, but if we're looking at subnational measures, that becomes a little bit more complicated, because then you will have to look at individual data points and individual indicators within the inventory and compare that, because otherwise it doesn't really match the scope. So it's very hard to do that kind of comparison for non-national measures.
Thank you, Marion. Maybe I can just add to that. If you, of course, here in your presentation, we talked about national level greenhouse gas inventories. Of course, there's also greenhouse gas inventories at city level, for instance. They were not the topic of your presentation, but the same question could apply, because what we have included also in the transport volume is methodologies on comprehensive urban mobility plans. And here some methodologies actually use basically an inventory approach for the monitoring and reporting. And in that sense, meaning that you have an ex-ante baseline, which is projecting your emission growth for transport for a city, for the territory of within the territory of a city, and then you can actually use a city-level greenhouse gas inventory of your transport emissions to then monitor the actual developments and compare that to the ex-ante baseline for the city. So just
actually, and that relates back to the previous question on adjusting the baselines ex post. So that's how you usually would do that. You have your inventory, and that represents your with measure scenario, and then you have your ex ante baseline that you recalculate, adjusting some of those factors that you mentioned, like population and GDP.
And another thing to think about is that you can use information from the inventory as the default values. For example, if you have somehow gotten an average trip length or some type of fuel efficiency or some average data from an inventory, you can use that as an input. And if you've changed the mode share, mode split, or if you're changing some of these other variables, and you keep default values or historic values that you obtain from an inventory, you can merge the two together in that way.
Okay, thank you. We'll go on with the next question, which is also a very good one. Many countries do not have a good inventory, and it seems costly to do surveys for financially constrained countries. But this seems to be the only choice to collect tier 2 or 3 data, such as passenger kilometers, occupancy. How can we overcome this problem? I'm copying this question also to the chat log.
And surveys don't have to be expensive, although if they're going to be good, they may end up being expensive. There are also other ways now using mobile device data, for example, and or you were using traffic count data in your China example. So it's yes, it can be expensive to do a statistically valid
household survey,
household, OD survey, but there are other ways to get data that's less expensive.
And taking this up, what we have also done some work previously in the work that we have done in China, where we actually looked at basically a data collection guide for urban transport emissions monitoring, where we look at different degrees, different possible degrees to collect data. They're of course very disaggregated ones where you need a lot of data, and of course you're always happy to have a household survey which gives you very detailed data, but even countries with a lot of budget, they don't do them every year, obviously maybe every 5 years, and then do smaller surveys in between. This is one way to go about it, also to do smaller sample surveys and then extrapolate your data based on these results, and then just do a larger, more representative survey every few years. As Chuck mentioned, there's new opportunities coming up with mobile data that can be looked into, and traffic counting is really also a relatively cheap option for some data types that can be used. But it's also not really not possible in general terms to, I think, answer this question fully. We will have the problem that without data you can't do it. So of course everybody would like to get the calculations done as cheaply and easily as possible, but there is no way around collecting data. So if you want to have good calculations, you need at least sufficiently robust data, and this means also that you have to collect some data. So otherwise it's it's not possible. But I think there's new ways coming up that can actually help us lower the costs in the future, and sometimes the costs are actually not as high as might be expected, especially compared to other costs. If you look at large infrastructure investments, then the cost for data collection for monitoring is really very small compared to these other costs. So it's also a little bit a question of prioritizing these investments.
And Urda, maybe I can add that's also one area where if you're smartly organizing the MRV of measures, you can actually avoid duplicating work and creating a lot of synergies that also help to cut cost if you make use of harmonized data standards, etc.
Yeah, very important. Thank you for that one. We have another question that reads, this appears to relate primarily to actions to be taken by governments or infrastructure providers. How does this all relate to methodologies that are designed to be used by companies within the logistics supply chain? Yeah, thank you very much for that question. I think we are learning that we need to point this out more clearly in the beginning. You're entirely right with your question. This is the focus of the transport volume, and the reason is that it basically comes from the rationale of the climate negotiations, where we're talking about mitigation actions of countries and governments. And so the focus was more on methodologies related to policies and actions that are undertaken by governments than by private companies. So, but of course that is actually a good point, and maybe something for for the future, for an updated revision. But there are some methodologies that also address that, but it's true that we didn't include these purely logistic, like carbon footprinting sort of methodologies in this volume.
Yeah, some of the freight methodologies or the alternative fuel methodologies, especially at the CDM level, are project-based, and you can certainly transfer that methodology to an individual company if it's not designed already for something like that. But as Urda said, most of this stuff is starting with the idea that it will be a higher or governmental action.
It's also because this came from this whole NAMA discussion, which are by definition activities that have to be, that are registered by national governments, and so that's why the focus was very much on that. But of course it is also useful, especially because we're seeing this discussion becoming stronger and stronger also as part of the official climate negotiations. The private sector and non-state actor activities, they are more than needed, of course, to reach our climate targets. So I think it's a good point to keep in mind that additions in that regard may be useful for future versions of the volume. So thanks for that one. I'm just reading another question. It says, it seems different institutions or different users use different methodologies, and I think there is a scope to harmonize approaches to account greenhouse gas emissions in transport sector for consistency and harmonized reporting. Yeah, thank you very much. I think it's very true. Many different institutions all they use different methodologies, at least when it comes to the details. As I said before, there is no process, as was the case in the CDM, to harmonize the approaches to a large extent. There are discussions ongoing regarding the reporting on nationally determined contributions, which include mitigation actions, to be more transparent, which is a good thing in my view, but does not go to this level of detail of really harmonizing exactly as in the CDM way the approach to how to report. However, maybe Chuck wants to add to that, and this is what we try to do with these cause impact chains. There are the fundamental approach to many of the different methodologies is often quite similar.
Right, and you know, the CDM methodologies, although they were standardized, there sometimes will be several different methodologies for very similar projects, because each project was slightly different and might have a slightly different effect. So I think it's better to do the harmonization at a higher level and not say, you know, you must consider all of these all these variables for every possible project, but to try to look a little bit higher level, as we showed in the graphics, and just make sure that you're taking into account the key aspects of each action, because your data is going to always be different, you know. So, and the specifics of the action may be different. In fact, one of the sections in each chapter looks at the contextual variables, so that if you put in a bus rapid transit in one area that has different type of land use than another, you're going to have completely different effects. and you won't be able, so you're going to need to measure these things differently.
Thank you. I would like to take up another question which says, when we consider fuel consumption, have we considered fuel to tank emissions, which are also important?
Some of the methodologies, the alternative fuel methodologies, definitely consider that, and others do not, because they're not looking back at the actual fuel production process. It really depends on the methodology.
Then we have another interesting question on baseline. What is your view on developing country-specific standardized baselines, subject to be updated every 3 years under the UNFCCC process for specific transport interventions? This would potentially complement MRV of NAMA and also complement national inventories. So how about standardized baselines for different actions for countries? Marion, would you like to have a go at that one?
Yeah, I can try. I'm not sure, and I think it nicely, Chuck already nicely introduced that right now. I think it's extremely challenging to try and develop standardized baselines for measures, because even slight changes in the design and slight changes in the actual situation on the ground can lead to quite drastic differences in effects. So I'm a bit worried that this would lead to proliferation of standardized baselines and not really lead to more efficiency. Probably, I personally would also suggest to harmonize at a different level and try and get clear what kind of data we need for what kinds of purposes and how you collect that, and maybe try and provide better default data at regional levels or country levels than trying to quantify baselines for individual activities. Chuck, maybe you can add your views on that.
Well, like Urda was talking about dynamic baseline, you don't know what's going to happen in the future. So, you know, if you just lock in, you're going to end up like with the hot air that, you know, came in the CDM from the Russian, you know, the USSR dissolving, right? That something happens and suddenly your baseline is no longer valid. Is it a good thing to continue to use that as your basis of comparison? I think only if you don't have appropriate data, or if there's some other political reason would you want to do that. So I don't know. It seems
I think
like
it's a very tricky issue. It's also, there's been efforts under the CDM before to develop standardized baselines, and it's an effort that didn't. Well, first of all, the question is what are you, when we talk about standardization, which aspects are the ones that we actually want to standardize? And what has came out of this discussion under the CDM is our tools for setting, how to set baselines, for instance, for shift in the freight sector, and also for shift in passenger transport. So they came up with these tools that basically describe a standard approach towards setting your baseline. But nevertheless, of course, the standard approach is then filled with locally specific data. So think that it can be a standard approach, but the baseline, I mean, the outcome of this calculation and the values that go into it are not standardized, and there's, yeah, I think it's a very difficult issue to try to do that on a practical level. Yeah. But of course, I see the point. The point is to avoid trying to collect expensively collect data, but this would mean that you use default values, and these, of course, they should be country specific. And if they're country specific, then it means you already have to collect that data. It'd be very difficult to use the same defaults over different regions. But of course, if there's no locally available data, this is what is being done. Obviously, you have to fill your data gaps, and you do this with the best assumptions that you can make. So, but I don't think I don't see it happening that that such standardization will come up for now. We are coming to a close. There's 2 more minutes. I would like to pick up a question on freight again, because we've received a couple now, and there's been a remark on the earlier question that how can governments actually achieve reductions in the freight sector without involvement of companies? And we've seen that many NDCs are completely ignoring freight. It's true. That's true for some NDCs that they're not looking at freight. Although this also has to be taken with a little bit of caution. We've also seen in our analysis, because we've done an analysis of NDCs also for transport, and what we're seeing is that, of course, freight is not explicitly mentioned in many. However, there's a lot of investment in rail and also in shipping. So it's more on this policy level that NDCs are addressing. NDCs are addressing the freight sector by providing more infrastructure for rail and freight, for rail and shipping. Sorry, and this is both inland shipping and sometimes also short sea shipping or similar activities. So freight is included in that sense of actually providing more infrastructure that will allow a shift in the freight sector. But of course, there's other things like logistics approaches, better logistic chains, and also logistics centers and things like that have not been approached widely in the NDC. So yes, I mean, I agree that we should, that there's a need to involve the private sector for the freight transport, definitely. And some other things included are incentives for fleet renewals and things like that. But it's nevertheless, I agree. And also there was a comment on the ton-kilometer approach. I think maybe our answer wasn't very clear on that one. We will also pick up the questions afterwards in the follow-up, and also try to answer them again in written to follow up on this webinar. It's of course, it's true that you also have to look at the ton-kilometer that are being transported and on different vehicles to see the effects. It's 1 minute past our time, and I think we've been through almost all of our questions. There are a few left that we don't have time to cover anymore now, but we'll try to get back to them in the follow-up. And I would like to thank everybody again for their participation and their active involvement, especially in the question sessions. This was very interesting also for us, and I hope that it's been interesting for you as well. And we're looking forward. We'll continue to work on that. And as Chuck already mentioned earlier, if you have any other comments or recommendations or methodologies that should be included, we'd be happy to discuss how we can do it. So thank you again, everybody, for your attention and your inputs. Also, thanks again to the speakers. And I hope that we will hear each other and read each other, and maybe then also see each other next time. Thank you.